The paradox of oneness, one integrated system, yet diversity is what keeps the system living. We will not know peace until we celebrate the differences. No hierarchy in God's kingdom, neither no supremacist. All people, all equal, so basic, so simple. One day the world will wake and we will all surrender. Give up the guns for the power of love. No, we're never giving up till we see the rising sun and move as one. Reparations for the past hurt, one. Decolonization of the whole world, one. Healing up the generations, walk as one. One love, many nations move as one.
A pivot issue. It's a good day. This is Nick, your host again for Decolonizing the Way. And today we're going to talk about schools of indoctrination, collision of church and state. So basically we're going to be talking about boarding schools and the effect that they've had on our generations and what we're going to do and what has happened and what we can do as a result. So I just want to share a few things real quick. So really with all the recent events going on, there's a recent report that has just been released by the United States government, specifically the Department of the Interior, which is just recently tackled the issue of boarding schools and kind of grabbing their scope of what all happened and just how significant it was. And basically in this podcast, I feel like it's important to talk about it at this time more than any other time. I've already kind of touched on it a little bit on past episodes, and while I was kind of wrestling with what to talk about, Spirit brought to me like, this is what I need to talk about. I had some counsel from other people, other relatives that kind of pushed me in that direction, kind of nudged me, I should say, in that direction. And then I just praying about it, and Spirit kind of led me to talk about it. And it's really cool because later on in the conversation, we're actually going to have a really special treat. It's kind of a deep topic and can be kind of solemn, but we're going to have my hunka ina, my hunka mom, talk a little later about her experience at the boarding schools, first with the BIA run boarding school and then with a Catholic run boarding school. And so that's a special treat that you guys will get to hear. Really sacred story. And in this podcast, I have three main objectives. And the first one is to make people aware of the ugly side of colonial history, whether it's US, Canada, Mexico, Guatemala, this whole Spanish Empire south, the Anglos in the north. And this history isn't really discussed in history books often, much less general conversations in the wider society, especially in the US where it's very polarized. You either have it discussed openly in more liberal circles or not discussed any at all, or really pushed back against in more conservative circles. So I really want to get out of that paradigm though, and I just want to speak truth to power and also come from a very human standpoint and less of an angry standpoint. Just more of about healing, telling the truth so we can heal, not so much so one person can be right or the other person be wrong. The second is to discuss how the current epidemics of drug and alcohol abuse, as well as many other social ills in our communities, are due to state intervention to eradicate our ancestral way of life. That's a really big topic, but which I could make a whole nother podcast on, and I might do later on, but we're just going to touch on it a little bit. The third is to tackle all of this, and this is what I'll wrap up on, showing how the way is expressed, the Jesus way is expressed in and through the Messiah, and it's a paradigm-shifting way, which makes no space and no room for Western hierarchies of power and privilege. And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about. And first of all, I'm going to start with talking about preceding events in history which led up to the boarding schools. I think this is really important to talk about. Instead of the boarding schools just kind of being in a vacuum in history, like this happened and, but not having any historical context behind it. So it's really important to talk about the history of what led to the boarding schools in order to understand what led up to and understand why they happened, and then understand what happened as a result. And if we understand that whole picture, then we'll be able to understand how to correct it, how to make things right. So let's get into it, shall we? So first of all, U.S. history, stems from the early 1600s. Well, it's beginning in the mid to late 1700s and going into the 1800s. Many nations east of the Mississippi had already been relocated to Indian territory, quote unquote, which is now modern day Oklahoma. By the mid 1800s, most nations east of the Mississippi, that especially larger nations, were pushed out to Oklahoma, to Indian territory at the time. And this was, of course, designed to clear the land of the original inhabitants of those lands, the original caretakers and the ones that Creator gave responsibility over those lands, to pave the way for Euro-Americans to take possession of those lands and basically to thieve them or steal them so they could have it for themselves. And this foundational fact, largely has not been talked about in society. I mean, it's kind of taken for granted that indigenous peoples have had their lands taken away. But when people start trying to have conversation about it, it's like, well, that was in the past, right? Or, or either you just feel bad about it and there's nothing to do in the present. Like, the past mistakes that have happened, it's like someone hitting a child. You don't just say like, oh, well, that was in the past, that didn't happen. Or, if it happened, that's in the past, just forget about it. No, if you don't correct that now, then the wound that child generated on another child by hitting them is going to create real outcomes and real consequences in both of those children's lives. And this is the responsibility that we have to make things right. So once the European descent settlers acquired these lands, they found that land was still not enough to satisfy their needs and their wants. And thus, manifest destiny, or westward expansion, from sea to shining sea, as the song goes, the famous Western song goes, was deemed necessary. And as they pushed westward gradually, it didn't just happen, big push and that was it. It kind of happened systemically. First you had settlers go and mostly, especially in the mid, 1840s, and so, going to California for gold and all that, the gold rush, and in Colorado and places like that, you had them kind of traveling through native peoples, native nations' territories, but not really necessarily stopping in those places, even though some of them did. It was more to get through there to get to the other side of the West. But of course, what ended up happening is, there was territorial disputes. Native nations, just like any nation would not, these settlers brought diseases with them. They brought other things with them that were detrimental to our nations. They were intruding. They were messing with the bison. And that was, of course, a food supply. So they were completely disrupting the balance of things in the world. And indigenous people's response can kind of be summed up in two responses. One is that they either resisted westward expansion of the settlers, or they retreated deeper into their ancestral territories to kind of get away and try to avoid tension, or a combination of the two. And usually it was a combination of the two. Most Native nations kind of had many resisting, while other parts of the nation were kind of backing up, and then it just gets really messy from there. It was kind of a combination of the two, though. And like I was talking about with the bison, with their near extermination, they almost wiped out the bison population, and it was done intentionally to subdue indigenous peoples. And you can find quotes demonstrating that and documents. But this was done also, they attempted to exterminate our native peoples as well. And when they realized that this couldn't be done, they came to the treaty table with these nations, and the nations came to the treaty table also. And most Native nations, even though these treaties were not necessarily in their best interest, the terms of the treaties especially were not in their best interest. It drastically reduced their previous territorial, ancestral territories, or pushed them on a whole nother people's territory altogether. A lot of them agreed for the reason of their food supplies being cut short and them just, barely having anything. And then also to avoid further warfare, they didn't want to be attacked anymore. They were looking out for the best interest of their people as leaders of those nations, they were like, you know what? We have to look out for our people at the end of the day and make sure that they're good. So even though these treaties were not necessarily in their best interest, they ended up agreeing to them. And these treaties, of course, would be broken, opening up much reservation land that was promised to them up to settlement also. And it's always been about the land. But kind of the transitional point now to get talking into this is kind of the history behind boarding schools, but there was a period after which the mentality of extermination, so before this point, extermination and kind of like relocation, these were the policies, like relocate, and exterminate, but indigenous people still had reservation land that was promised to them. So like, how can we get that land away from them? How can we get themselves to wipe themselves out? And this is where the policy of assimilation came in. And this policy is really sinister because it basically entails children of these nations being taken away from their parents and forcibly, and their families and their nations, and being taken away to a government or church-run boarding school, and their hair being chopped off, their clothing being changed to Western clothing, all their other clothing had to be burned or whatever, taken off, discarded somehow. They couldn't speak their own languages. They had to speak English. Many of them did not speak English, so that's a problem. So they were punished every time they didn't speak English, so a lot of them just went mute, and eventually, out of desperation and survival, learned English. But these are just a few of the things, not to mention all the abuse, which we'll talk about later, but these are what they encountered, these children, when they went to these schools. And they had to stay in these schools for, the whole school year, and they barely saw their families. And this was intentional. The administrators of these schools did not want them to be around their own people because they felt like that would disrupt the civilizing process, so to speak, which, quote unquote, anything but civilization, to be honest. But their primary motto, the primary motto that became very popular at this time, was kill the Indian, save the man. And of course, this is really rooted in the deep ethnocentric belief of the nation that Western culture is the divine ideal. It's God's ideal. We're the city on the hill. We are the ones who God has raised up for just a time as this. This is how the United States and other colonial nations in the Western Hemisphere who came here all across the continent have seen themselves as the saviors and as the ones that everybody else needs to reach to. Because of this belief, which we can still see very predominantly in the US politics especially, our cultural lifeways as nations and who we are were considered barbaric, savage, and backwards. In order to progress this thinking, indigenous peoples were taught, that, especially the children in these schools, that they must become like the Euro-Americans in every way and leave their primitive ways behind. Quote unquote primitive ways. And even worse than this, even if it could be any worse than, the government instituting this system, even worse, different Christian denominations got on board and came and set up schools which were designed to do what the government schools did, but with the added addition of Western-centric colonial Christianity, their lens being that lens and teaching Christianity through these institutions and teaching I should specify here, a Eurocentric and colonial centered Christianity. That bears little resemblance to the way of being that the Messiah himself set up, but we'll get to that later. Now, in these religious schools, authorized by the US government, Canadian governments, even Mexican and governments further south, there was a lot of sexual, physical, emotional, mental abuse. These were normalized. These were rampant. And in a few minutes, we're actually going to share a very, like I said before in the beginning, a story of this. Now, if that's not heavy enough, getting to the effects of this system. Alcoholism, PTSD, drugs, loss of self-worth, shame for being indigenous. These were all the effects of what the system was designed to do. And really what the boarding school system was designed to do was generate an entire generation, produce an entire generation of kids, because eventually the elders of our nations and the parents of these children who were taken away, time goes on, they pass away. If they can produce an entire generation that is assimilated and does things the way they wanted us to do things, then we would teach our children and their children, and then they would be able to take the land right out from under us. And pretty soon, we would wipe ourselves out. We would no longer exist as nations. So this was the insidious plan. And because of this plan, because the effects of it are alcoholism, drugs, murder, rape, PTSD, loss of self-worth, shame for being indigenous and trying to be something you're not. All of these and many more social ills are a result of, and even poverty and a lot of these things that get characterized with our people are the result of government intervention in our lifeways. Before colonization, our nations were thriving. We weren't dependent on any. The only thing we were dependent on was Creator and the Earth, Grandmother Earth. We weren't dependent on an outside nation for anything. They created that reality. And as a response to this, many people in the Native community, you have what they call, and these are kind of derogatory terms depending who you are and how you see it, but just telling the truth here. You either have what they characterize usually as sellouts or colonized natives. And this term is often used for those who were assimilated by the system and underwent it, maybe resisted at first, but then kind of succumbed to it and just stayed with it and abandoned everything and rejected anything to do with their people and their cultural lifeways. So you have that response to the boarding school. And then you have the traditionalist response, traditional natives. And this is the term that is often used for those who underwent often the presence of these schools and went through that assimilation process, but either consciously resisted from the get-go and resisted through the whole time, or found themselves and their people later in life and reconnected to that. Now, many of the traditionalists want nothing to do with Jesus, understandably, because of abuse that was done in his name. And with that, we're going to kind of segue into my Ina's conversation. And so just listen in, and then I'll be right back, and we'll finish up this conversation.
Roberta Whiting, I wanted to translate that. I agree that everyone, all my relatives, my Lakota name is Herschel Woman, and my English name, and I'm 69 years old, Lakota woman. I'm a fluent speaker, and I'm an elder of my Tiwahe, my Tioshvaya, and I'm a grandmother, great-grandmother, and I just wanted to share my experience while I was at the boarding school. And we were taken to the government boarding school in Pine Ridge, South Dakota in 1960. When my sister was 8 and I was 7 years old, they took us there. But that was her second year with school, and Mine was, that was my first year. And at the boarding school, we were there for a week or just a few days. And my sister was gone. And so I was wondering where she went, but she didn't come back. Night came and she was still gone. And the next day, my mother came and she stayed with us. Well, she stayed with me in the dormitory, but she was there to identify my sister's body because she got killed there at the boarding school there by some 3 other girls. And that was very traumatic for me. I didn't understand death at that time. And I always thought that she would come back, but she never came back. And so after her wake and funeral, my parents took me to the Catholic boarding school, where I went to school for 12 years there, stayed there, went to boarding school, and went to school. But I had a lot of good experiences there, but the bad experiences that I experienced at that time outweigh the good. I experienced, I didn't speak English. I didn't speak English when I first went to school, so it was really hard for me to understand, what I was supposed to do, and that in itself was a trauma to me. I was raised at home on our land that we had, 160 acres. My grandma and grandpa and my mom and dad, we lived there. My mom and dad lived in a log cabin, and my grandma and grandpa lived in a frame house next door. But that's where I grew up, and we spoke Lakota, and my grandparents gardened, and we did different things, when the seasons came. We picked choke cherries, and my grandmother would pound or grind to make patties and dry them and get ready for the winter. She'll put them away. And when there was, they brought her deer meat, then she would dry it, cut it up and dry it, and then she'd put it away for the winter time. And then we did that with team sila. We went team sila hunting with her. Wild turnip that we eat here are one of our traditional foods. And so we'd go and do that, and then we'll come back and help her braid them and hang them out to dry. And then she'll put those away for the winter time. And so it was fun. And then with my grandparents garden, so some evenings my grandmother would build a fire outside, and she'd put a pot on there, and she'd make soup. She'd get corn from the garden and squash and different things, and she put in some of the dried deer meat in there, and a little bit of salt pork and corn on the cob, and she'd cook it for a while, and then she'd make bread and coffee, and we'll eat. And then after dinner, my grandpa would sing. He was a singer. And he danced at powwows and stuff. So he would sing, and he wanted us to dance, so we had to dance. My two sisters, my two brothers, and I, and they would, and it was fun. They would laugh, and so that's how I grew up. We spoke nothing but Lakota at home, and it was really a sense of belonging while being at home with my grandparents and my mom and dad. And then the day came when it was time for me to go to school, and I had that horrible experience at the government boarding school. So they took me to the Catholic boarding school, and that's where I stayed, and I had the experiences. My Lakota language I couldn't speak, or any of the things that we were taught to do at home I couldn't do. And it was strange to me, and I couldn't understand why I was sent there, because it just felt like I didn't belong there, but I stayed there, and I experienced physical abuse by a volunteer worker that came to work there, and she couldn't control the girls, and so she had to take it out on somebody, and it was me. And that was a traumatic experience for me too, because I was never hit or spanked or anything at home, because they would just speak to me. My grandparents or my mom and dad would speak to me about something that I did that, everything was a learning experience, so they would explain to me what was going on. But at the boarding school, we were constantly punished for almost everything that we did. And I experienced sexual abuse when I was in the 4th grade by one of the Jesuits that worked there. And that was another traumatic experience for me, because it was like he was stalking me, and I up to this day, I still believe that he did watch me all the time, and I couldn't tell anybody about what happened, and so I had to live with that. And the spirituality that I believed in, I couldn't practice or talk about it or anything. And we were just we just had to be quiet all the time. We were just given numbers, and that's what we were there. And we didn't have no birthdays or anything, and I always wanted to go home, but I didn't know, because I was so young. I didn't know where my home was and which way to even go. And we ran away a couple times, but we got caught, and they brought us home back to the boarding school, and we got punished, and we got punished severely. We were spanked with razor strap, and we had bruises and from being hit with that razor strap because we ran away. So that was another traumatic experience for me. And there were so many incidents that happened that I wished my sister was there to watch out for me, but she wasn't ever going to come back again, and I had to learn how to live with that at a young age, and I became a survivor. I knew how to survive, I knew how to take care of myself, and I learned how to fight. And so up to today, I'm still suffering from the colonization or the influence that they had over me for that many years. Today I have to tell myself and remind myself that I'm a Lakota, that it's okay for me to do this and to do that, to love myself and to love my kids, and that everything isn't a sin. And so I still deal with that on a daily basis. I had to learn how to love myself so that I can learn to love my children, my grandchildren, and to hug them. But I don't know. Everything's coming out now in the media and different and I'm glad that that's happening. Maybe we can start to heal, maybe have some kind of compensation so that we can live our life, the rest of our days here on Jimunka in a way that was taken away from us. But I still struggle with being at the boarding school and being brainwashed and all of that. And this is probably the third time that I'm sharing my story. And I just want to say Wopila for listening to me and listening to my story. Go ahead, Chitu.
So just going to ask a few questions like I said before. The first one is what religious tradition, you said there was 2 boarding schools that you went to, right?
Yes.
Okay. What was the first boarding school's religious tradition? In other words, what religion or religious tradition did they come from?
The Pine Ridge boarding school was the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
And so they took you to church, if you're a Catholic, they took you to the Catholic Church, Episcopal, whatever. All the churches were downtown, and that's where you went. And the Catholic boarding school was just Catholicism.
Okay. So basically
there was no Lakota spirituality involved in anywhere in either of the boarding schools.
Thank you. The first boarding school that you went to, what year was that when you started that boarding school?
That was August of 1960.
1960. Okay. So relatively not long ago at all. Not long ago at all. Okay. So basically, to clarify, the first boarding school was a government boarding school, and then the second one was basically a religious run boarding school. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you. Second question that came up on my mind is,
Okay.
and this is a pretty big question. You can flesh it out as much as you'd like to, but what differences did you find between what you had been taught as a child before you went to boarding school and your Lakota spirituality and the new religious experience that was introduced to you? Like, what were the key differences that you saw between boarding school spirituality or religion and what you experienced before you went?
I think that what I've experienced and what living at the Catholic boarding school for months on end and just listening to them tell us and teach us and preach to us about their belief system. And the Lakota spirituality and the Catholicism are totally opposite. We were baptized when we were born, and you were born baptized into the Catholic Church. But as a Lakota, we believe that children are born sacred. And that goes, you could say that about almost everything. That our belief system is the opposite of theirs. Especially when it comes to money. We didn't need money. And that's what they believe in. And so that's what they taught us at the boarding school, was that we needed to be educated and we needed to have this go to church on Sunday and observe all of these holidays. And as time went on, after I got out of the boarding school, and I knew that wasn't my way of praying, because I didn't believe that way. I believed in the Lakota way, what I saw at home, because the Lakota, it's your way of life every day. We don't just go to church on Sundays. We prayed every day, every morning, when there's a meal, when there's a ceremony, and at night we pray. And for everything, there's a prayer and song, because that was our way of life, and that's how I wanted to live, because I feel comfortable when I do that. But so I had to really re-educate myself, and because I was not that it was not my religion, and that we had our own spirituality as the people, because it's in our language and our way of life and how we believe. how we honor our relatives. And so all those things I had to relearn, and it was hard for me even up to today to forget what I was taught at the Catholic boarding school. And in the beginning, when I was in my early 20s, and I was so lost because of what I was taught and how I wanted to live and be myself as a Lakota person, because Lakota, and growing up, my grandparents and parents always told me that Lakota language was very important, that we needed to know it because it was our way of life. Everything that we needed to know was in our language. And so I knew that I didn't, that wasn't my way, and that I had a chance to make my life the way I wanted it as a Lakota grandmother. And I learned a lot from my grandmother. She taught me a lot how to do things and about life. And just this evening I was feeling bad because I wished that she was here to tell me, comfort me, because I was feeling so bad. But I remembered that I could speak to her at any time I wanted to, because that was our way of life. But so the things that I learned at the Catholic boarding school aren't useful I can't use those in my life today, because as a Lakota person, we have our own values and stuff in life, and how we need to treat people and how we need to be. All of that is in our culture, and it's the opposite of what I was taught at the Catholic boarding school.
Opila. The third question I had was, were you, like when you mentioned with the first boarding school, and I know for the second you were brought there by your parents, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The first one, were you taken from your parents, or did your parents bring you to that one? How did that work?
No, they came and got us.
Okay.
Our parents didn't take us there. They came and got us and told us that that's where we had to go to school. And so they got us ready and they took us. They brought us to the BIA boarding school.
So the only way you could go to transition to the other boarding school was by their permission. Just trying to clarify. So the way that the only way you could go to the other boarding school was if you got the BIA's permission to transfer there. You couldn't just get out of there and be like, oh, I'm gonna, like your parents couldn't be like, I'm gonna raise her at home. Like you had to be in one of their institutions, whether it was the Catholic boarding school or their BIA boarding school.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mopila. It's helpful. It's just this conversation is so relevant because a lot of people in the outside society are not aware at all that any of this happened. It's still very new. And that's why conversations like this are so important.
Yeah.
Because people can hear your voice right now. You're a real person. You're not, I think it's a little bit different when it's somebody that has passed away already or passed on. And, it's just a story that they can't hear for themselves, just words on paper, or on a textbook or whatever. But, when you actually hear somebody's words and their voice and their spirit, it's like, it comes to life and it makes it real. One thing that I kind of caught on to with what you were saying when you were sharing your story is, and this kind of leads to my second to last question, is it seems like they defined being Lakota or being indigenous, whatever nation you're from, as being sinful or somehow evil. Would that be an accurate statement? Would that be an accurate way of saying it? Like, do you kind of understand what I can rephrase it if you need me to clarify it.
I think that how I understand that. Oh, could you say it again?
Yeah, I know. I kind of made it more complicated than it should have been. I was trying to say it in a way that would be like simple, but yet I overcomplicated it. I guess to say it, I'm just gonna ask the question instead of trying to make it a statement. Did they, from what you experienced and maybe what they told you, or with their words or their actions more so, did they define being Lakota, like whoever was orchestrating these boarding schools, and both the Catholic run one and the BIA run one? Did it seem like they defined being Lakota or being indigenous as sinful or evil? Is that
as being what?
Sinful or evil? Is that kind of what was taught?
We were told constantly that our way of life was that we were savages, and that we were. But that was the word that they used a lot, was that, and they called us savages, and that our ceremonies were worshiping the devil.
Okay, that's pretty. So they didn't say it in the terms that I said it, but they basically, I mean, they even went beyond how I said it. They said it in another way. Yeah, that's wow. It's even for me, it's different hearing stories. I've heard a lot of stories, about boarding schools, and it's different hearing it from you because I know you to a different level relationally than just someone I read about. And hearing about it, I know people that have undergone the boarding schools as well, but the ones that I know don't talk about it because it's too painful and they haven't come to that place in their own lives to even feel comfortable talking about it,
Yeah.
And just the power to be able to speak about it is liberating, and being able to speak truth to because that's really what it comes down to, right? Is whenever there's an abusive system or an abusive person, their power is when, we all hear these stories about, when an abuser is abusing someone, they tell them, don't tell anybody, be quiet.
Yeah.
Because they don't want their crimes to be known. They know what they're doing is wrong. And yet, there's something deep within us, that you could argue that Creator gave us that tells us what we're doing is wrong, but they try to hide it. They're ashamed of it, but they don't want to separate it. They don't want to do anything different at the same time, or else they wouldn't be doing it, right? So it's very powerful that you're able to share these things and just say it like it is.
I think this time it was easier for me to tell you without crying. I wrote it down. I wrote all of it down, and I sent it to Washington. But then, when I had to sit and I was writing before I typed it up, I wrote it down, pen and paper, and I had to think about all of that, my past, living at the boarding school and having to deal with all of those, and I've been through a lot
Mm.
because of what I was taught there and how I should be. And that didn't, so it was easier for me to talk about it this time. And it was hard for me when I had to sit down and write it down, and I had to stop, and I won't write anymore, and I would pray about it, then I'll go back to writing. But it was really, I've been through a lot. But today, as an elder, I know who I am, and I'm not what they say I am. I have grandparents, and I have great leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. That were just as powerful as St. Peter and St. Paul and all them people. I carried a lot of anger for many years because of that, of how I had to deal with them. And I was bitter, and I was angry, and I was mean. I wasn't who I was meant to be until I didn't give them the power anymore to control my thoughts and my actions and how I wanted to live.
That's helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
My last question is, if you could say anything or give any advice to someone who underwent these boarding schools or, the residential schools in Canada, what advice would you give them?
I think that sharing your story about what happened and let people know, especially the young people, so that they will know and understand, because we live with a lot of historical grief and trauma as Lakota people. It's in our DNA because of what our ancestors went through and what we continue to go through today. But that's what I wanted to share.
Wapila. All right. Thank you for...
Did that one answer the question?
Yeah, it did. It did. You answered the question very well. Yes, thank you. I'm just going to end the recording here. That's the end of this recording for Maina.
Oh, yeah, because the more you talk about your story, you're letting it go slowly. You're not carrying it with you, because carrying all that traumatic stuff that happened, that's a lot to carry for a lot of years, like I did. But when I realized that I didn't have to do that, and who the blame really was on, it wasn't me. I wasn't the sinner. They were.
Yep. That's powerful. So the sooner you can tell your story, the faster healing will happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just let it out. That's good. Good advice. Thank you.
And you can begin to heal slowly. Because I spent a good part of my learning years there, learning that stuff that wasn't even meant for me. Because I have my own way of life as Lakota.
That's helpful. Yes. Very helpful. This whole conversation, I feel like, was very productive. Just because, first of all, you sharing your story and then answering questions about your story just helps bring clarity to anyone who's going to listen to this. And, because I know they probably ask a lot of these questions that I'm asking in their minds. So I'm like, well, let me ask her while I have her here and while we're talking about her story, so it can be all one piece. But thank you, for answering these questions and for telling your story is very powerful. And I think sharing our stories, like you said, also helps prompt other people to share their stories and have that confidence to do it. So it's good. It's good. Cool. I'm going to wrap up this recording and stop recording now. Man, I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. It was very real, very, just very raw, but it was needed, and it was a very sacred story to share. So, wopila to Ina, Roberta Joyce Whiting, for sharing that. She lives on the Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation over in Porcupine area, South Dakota. So with that, they did all of this in the name of God. They did it in the name of Jesus. And I really want to discuss now the trajectory of that story and kind of share just how sinister it was and how manipulative it was, not only to our people, but also to the original ones who wrote the story of Scripture themselves. And the story itself starts out with the Creator, Yahweh, creating a world out of chaos, bringing order and function out of dysfunction and chaos. And out of that story, humans decide to bring chaos and dysfunction back into the world through exalting self and self-interest above other-centeredness. And the systems that we see in play throughout history, whether political, or social, or intercommunal, tend to reflect that same principle of selfishness in every degree. Looking out for me or my nation above you and your nation. And that principle was birthed into the world, but didn't always exist there. And the empires throughout history all have done evil and corrupt things. But what Westerners generally don't point out, even in religious circles, is that the gods of money, sex, and power have evil spirits working behind them, manipulating the human power heads and the heads of state that are actuating these policies. In other words, there's a cooperation between the dark spirits in the spiritual realm and their human agents who are cooperating with them. Therefore, there's dual complicity. And with that being said, I kind of want to jump into a few texts that I feel like are really crucial to this conversation, and I feel like are helpful and relevant. And the first text comes from the Psalms of David. And this is what it says. This is Psalm 115. Not to us, Yahweh, not to us, but to your name be the glory, because of your love and faithfulness, or trustworthiness. Why do the nations say, where is their mighty one? Where is their God? Ours is in the heavenly realm. He does whatever is good. But their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. And it's interesting because Ina, conversation, just interjecting here, said they're kind of alluded to that their god is money. You know, they serve money. And it's interesting because back in this time when this is being written in the Psalms, money was silver and gold. And silver and gold can definitely be an idol made by human hands. And if you think about the next words, usually what's on coins of money is people or faces or bodies. Continues, they have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but they cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make such things will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. It's interesting because later on in the story, when Yeshua comes on the scene, there's a scene in Matthew. It's recorded in Matthew 3 and a few other of the Gospels, where the enemy, the Satan, which the Satan, people usually think like, oh, you know, they usually think of it like a name. But in Hebrew, it's Ha-Satan. Ha-Satan, it means the enemy, the adversary, the deceiver. And so this being, the spiritual being, takes him up onto a high mountain. And he says to him, shows him all the empires throughout history in the world and their beauty, their splendor, their power. And he said, all of these I will give to you if you'll bow down and worship me, because they've been given to me. And in other words, he's kind of saying like, these empires have been given to me. That is, they are of my self-exalting character. They are of my nature. They exalt themselves at the expense of others. And that's exactly what has been done. And then this one I feel like is like the most clear. And later on, this is in the context of his Sermon on the Mountain. And he is talking about judgment. He's talking about the narrow and wide gate. But notice what he says here. And I feel like this is like probably the most relevant text when it comes to this issue. He says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing. In other words, they come to you looking outwardly innocent, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick up grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a corrupt tree brings forward corrupt fruit. A good tree cannot bear corrupt fruit, and a corrupt tree cannot bear corrupt fruit. Every tree that does not bear good or healthy fruit is cut down and thrown into the furnace. Thus, by their fruits you will recognize them. In other words, in this first part, Yeshua is saying, if they come, no matter what they say or what they do, if their actions, if their fruits are not good, then you know they are not good, no matter what their professions are. And then he continues with an even more powerful saying. He said, not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, Lord, Lord, will enter my reign, but only those who do the will of my Father who is in the heavenly realm. Many will say to me on that day, Master, Master, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, in your name perform many miracles? Notice that's all done in his name. Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you doers of that which is crooked. And I feel like this is just so pertinent to history, especially when it comes to the imperial church. It's like he tells them, he warns them from the get-go before it even happens, like, watch out for false prophets. They're going to come. Watch out for deceivers. They're going to come. But then he finishes, he says, not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, not everyone who claims to know me will be part of the new creation. You know, he plainly says to them, only the one who does what is right, only the one who does the will of my Father, which is other-centered love. And then there's another part later on. John records it in his narrative. And he talks about how he's telling his early followers, he says, look, the ones who claim to follow Yahweh, Hebrew nation, they're going to kill you and think they're doing a service to God. Just said plainly, they're going to persecute you, they're going to even try to kill you, and they're going to think they're doing what God wants them to do. And warn them ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. I think he's warning everyone who the church or religion has hurt. This is what's going to happen ahead of time. Be aware. The parable in Matthew 13 of the corrupt plants also illustrates the same point. The harvesters come to him and ask him, didn't you just plant good seed in your field? Why is there then these corrupt seed in the field? Didn't kind of putting the blame back on him, but he says an enemy has done this. It wasn't my working. Caesar, a famous Roman emperor, had this to say when it came to the colonizing mindset that he had, and which could be perfectly illustrated throughout history, especially in regards to the colonizers coming here to the Western Hemisphere. Caesar had to say, I came, I saw, I conquered, which pretty much completely represents the colonial mindset of just exploit and take what you want because you're the one who has the most power. And Joseph Marshall, a pretty famous Lakota writer, he had this to say when he read that. He saw ancestral wisdom like this. We came, we saw, we adapted. In other words, we came, we saw, we came here, we were part of it, and then we adapted to it. We didn't try to change it. We changed to it. We adapted to it. Adaptation, however, I should specify, does not mean adopting the mentality or mindset of the colonizer or of the imperial system. It means being able to exist in both worlds while keeping that other-centered, indigenous mindset that our people have. And this is my own quote, and I feel like Spirit brought this to me right when I was kind of formulating how I was going to say everything I'm going to say in this podcast episode. And I want to share it with everybody. And it goes like this. The great lie is that advancement means to give up who you are, to become Western or Anglo or European in every way. The great truth is that advancement is to become more who you are meant to be as a loving human, retaining your unique cultural lifeways and history while also becoming more like Creator in the process. And I feel like that is the distinction between the great lie and the great truth that needs to be told. And in the end, Creator is going to hold especially accountable those who have used His name to victimize and hurt people and the earth and all of our relations. They're going to be held especially accountable for what they have done. And the ones who were victimized, the oppressed, they will be the ones who will be vindicated. Or as the Messiah said, the last will be first and the first will be last. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope it was a blessing. I hope it sparked some conversations, some thoughts. You can find our podcast on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts at the moment. We also have a Facebook page, Instagram page, and we're working on a few other pages as well. You can find us at Decolonizing the Way. So I hope this was a blessing, relatives, and look forward to seeing you next time. I'll be away for a few weeks due to ceremony, but once I get back around mid-July, I'm planning on shortly releasing another episode after I get back. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.